So today we're going to button up the wiring harness on this 80 MGB. So in the last video I had pretty much everything installed except for hooking up the horns and everything for the dash. So we got that all hooked up. I got the dash just kind of sitting in place, hanging on the bolts, but it's still not bolted in yet. But before I start testing everything, I wanted to get the radio and the USB port put in place so we can test them at the same time. Now, hooking a radio up on these things isn't really complicated at all. You got a white and green wire here, which is the radio wire. So you hook up the power to the radio to that. And I also have the USB piggybacked on that. We'll get that to that in a second. And then we got, he already had a ground hooked up. That was perfectly fine to use, so I stuck with that. Now, this is the orange wire on modern radios is the lighting wire. So you hook that to the white and red connector, which has an open spot in it. And in this case, since you've got the USB and we're not using a cigarette lighter, I went ahead and put a bullet connector on here and hooked the constant power to the radio for memory to that. This is a fused circuit, so don't get too worried about that. And then I hooked, since the ground was being unused for that, for the cigarette lighter, I went in and hooked the USB ground to it with just a spade connector. It made it really simple and easy. Now, I went ahead and piggybacked the USB onto this as well. Now, you might worry about how much amperage are we pulling here. Now, this radio has a fuse that's 10 amps, which means maximum draw this thing could ever draw would be a safety factor below 10 amps. Safety factor is usually like 20%, something like that. Some places will go more than that, some companies. So this would be probably a maximum draw of 8 amps, even with USB hooked up with something charging while the radio's on. I looked up the USB plug here. USB 3.0 plugs are the highest amperage USB plugs there are. They're 0.9 of 1 amp. And I've also heard some testing saying that even if you're plugging 2 things in at once, you still are only drawing 0.9 amps with both of them together at the same time. Now, even if we factor that this one doesn't do that, that's less than 2 amps between these two. And then you have a USB-C, which could be anywhere from 0.5 to 5 amps. So maximum draw on this couldn't be more than 7, just under 7 amps, probably only 6. But if you figure 7 amps and 8 amps, that's 15. So that's about as much as you'd want to pull through this wire. But you also got to figure that is maximum peak amperage. That is 4 things charging at once and the radio at full blast. Very unlikely scenario. So, and I'm just going to tell the owner, don't do that. You know, don't plug in any more than 1 thing at a time if the radio's on, and it should never be a problem. So then, once we get all this stuff hooked up, I got my fuse on the battery, then we start testing things. So, first of all, we got our clock working, that's a good thing. And then, first thing I'll usually check is lights. So get the lights on just first stage, which is marker lights, and go check all the marker lights, make sure everything's working. Now we had everything, but everything was working, the marker lights and everything was working, but these weren't initially. Common problem on these cars, usually it's just bad connection in here, or a lot of times the spring tension isn't enough, and we'll show you. So one of the common problems here is actually spring tension, where this wire here isn't, you're not getting connection at the bulb. A lot of times that's just this rubber boot holding it. You can take this rubber boot and kind of pull on it and get it to come back a little bit on the wire, maybe a couple millimeters, 1/16 of an inch or so, and release it, and sometimes that's just keeping the spring from putting enough tension on it, and then it'll push forward, giving spring tension and making them work again. That's what worked for this car. So with the marker lights on, then you can check to see if your rheostat's working. And like here, we can see these bulbs here. That's for the switches down here. And you generally have to turn your lights off to see all of these, or you can really look down in here and kind of see, but all the lights are working. The rheostat's actually working really nicely, which is not super common, so that's cool. And then you can check the headlights. Now there's a couple functions here. First, you got the flash to pass, and that's working fine. Then you can turn the headlights on, and then check high beam and low beam. That's working just fine, no problems with the switches. At this point, you can also check, make sure the boot light's working if you're wanting it to work. And the light here, which this one does work just fine, but I was finding that this wasn't switching back and forth. You couldn't turn it on and off manually with the doors shut. I'm leaving it off right now because I don't want it lit up the whole time I'm got the door open right now. But this was a replacement unit, aftermarket, and this stuff just wasn't bent quite right and wasn't moving smooth. I played with it a little bit, got it sitting where it wants, now it works like it's supposed to. Now that we have verified all the lights are working, now we can turn the ignition into the on position. Make sure that the fuse doesn't blow. That's always a good thing when the fuse doesn't blow. Then you can start checking other things. Like we can check the wipers, make sure the wipers are working. There's low speed, and then high speed. Now initially, these weren't actually working. Now that was a very simple problem in this case, was that the connector is a really tight fit on the new connectors. And you can think you have it in all the way and not quite have it all the way, and I just didn't quite have it in all the way. Pushed it that little bit extra bit to where it was bottoming out, worked fine. So now we can start looking at like the fan. There's low, and there's high. Now initially that wasn't working either, and it was just dirty contacts in the switch. Now you can replace the switch, or sometimes you can just flip it back and forth and it'll work again. Or like in this case, I ended up taking it apart and cleaning it. And I don't really suggest that on these newer switches because these are a bit fiddly to work with, and they can be hard to take apart without breaking them and without parts flying everywhere when they pop apart. But if you want to try it yourself, I would suggest being ready to buy a new switch anyway, because you might not fix it. So then we can look at turn signals, and turn signals are working just fine, right side and left side, and you'll look at front and rear. And then we look at hazard warning. Now the turn signals all go through the hazard warning switch on these cars. They have for, always have. So the power goes through the hazard warning switch and then to the turn signals. And then when you turn the hazard on, it turns power off to the turn signals. Now initially, these weren't working when I first plugged it in. If you remember correctly, from the last video, I said these wires down here at the hazard and flasher units had the heat shrink tubing on it. The heat shrink tubing denotes which ones they go to. In this particular case, they actually had the heat shrink tubing on the light green and brown wires on the wrong one. Swap those two around, everything works fine now. So the radio is working exactly as it should. I'm not going to turn it on right now because YouTube has a real thing about copyrights in music, and I'm not going to risk that. And this works just fine as it's supposed to. Now the reason I put this on the same as the radio here is I want that to be on switched power. Don't want to hook up the power all the time, or that'll stay lit all the time. If it stays lit all the time, then guess what? Between that and the clock, it's going to run your battery down. Now, We don't know yet if the temperature gauge works because we haven't started it yet. And we don't know if the fuel gauge works. Right now it's showing empty, but the gas tank might be empty as far as I know. Cars come in all the time like that. But also the late gauges or late cars are the worst ones for fuel gauges not working right because they have a separate ground wire on them back at the tank, and that ground wire has to be good for this to work. Now what you can do back here is you can actually ground out the sending unit or the wire to the sending unit, and that should go all the way to full. That shows you all the wiring's good. Everything's good up to the gauge, and the gauge works. Then you're looking at bad ground back there or a bad sending unit. Okay. So you don't want to forget to check the backup lights. Even though the backup lights aren't that great on these cars, you will miss them if they're not working. So you put it in reverse, lights or key on. Now this one wasn't working originally. Found out we had this here. I was pushing up against the connector, causing it to not make good connection. So we got a bit of a bad connection here. So we got to just kind of clean that up, make sure it stays working, and we'll be good there. And of course, the one last thing which we haven't checked yet was the washer pump. And it works fine. You do not want to run that thing dry. Make sure there's always fluid to it, because especially if a car's been sitting, because it can just rip the impeller right off the end of the motor. Seen it too many times. So now then we can take the fuse out that I got between the battery and the battery cable and try to start it. Now when I first tried to start it, it did absolutely nothing. So this would be the starter relay. So I checked for power at the white and red wire because I didn't even hear this clicking. And we had power there. So I double checked, make sure everything was hooked up right, everything was right. So then I took the original relay off, put a new one on. Now it cranks over just fine. So then from there, we'll hook the fuel pump back up, get fuel to the carburetor, and crank it over and see if it has any fire. Now you could actually go ahead and test for spark if you want, or you can just try to start it. And in my case, it started up, it runs, everything here is all hooked up and working just fine. So now we got to actually start this thing up and get it warmed up. Make sure that the temperature gauge is working as it's supposed to, and then monitor the temperature and see what temperature that the fans come on, and make sure they come on when they're supposed to. And just run it long enough to do that and go through a few cycles, make sure everything's working fine, because there is a circuit breaker here. This is not the correct circuit breaker. This is a replacement that somebody put in, because see, it should have spade connectors, not these round ones, but this is what you can find in the local parts store, and that's what's on this car, so I left that the way it is. Now, of course, we also got the anti-run-on solenoid, and what you basically do is once you shut it off, you just listen for this thing, because you'll hear this thing, it should click immediately as you turn the key off, and then 10, 15 seconds, something like that, after it shuts down, when oil pressure hits back down to 0, it should click again and close. And then you know that's working as well. Now, one of the other little things I'm going to do on this car, this is a transmission spark control solenoid. It actually is not part of the main harness, it's part of the transmission harness, but I'm disconnecting it. This is part of the emissions. It only activates in 4th gear, and so you only get vacuum to distributor only in 4th gear for cruising, and that's it. Not something that's really necessary, I don't think, but I have seen these things short out internally. And when they short out internally, they'll blow a fuse, and then the car will just die because it blows, I think, the white circuit, which is ignition and fuel pump. And what happens is you just struggle to figure out what the heck's going on. Why is this thing randomly dying on me? Until you correlate that it only happens in fourth gear and fourth gear only. So if we just disconnect that, we'll never have that problem. So we got it running now. We see the tach's working fine. One of the other common issues on these things is they'll take a few seconds to pop up and start working, or you tap on them, they'll start working. I put about maybe a half a gallon of gas in it just to make sure we had enough, and it popped up to half a tank. So don't know what that's all about just yet, but we'll do some more investigating just to be sure what's going on there. And then we'll see if the temperature gauge comes up as we start building some heat in the motor. Now, one thing to remember about the gauges on these things, from temperature gauge, tach, and fuel gauge, there is a separate voltage regulator under the dash that regulates these to 10 volts. If that's not working properly and it's getting full voltage, these will all read too high. So if you have anything, but there can be anything other than 10 volts, they can either read high or low depending on how that's reading. And they're difficult to test because digital multimeters don't work very well on them because they are a bimetallic spring and it goes back and forth. So you'll need a old analog one to properly test it with. And according to this, we are charging right about where we want to be charging at. You want 13.8 to 14.2 and 13.9, 14 at idle is pretty good. So I got my infrared thermometer here. We'll be checking that temperature here. So that's where the temperature bulb is at. And you got to make sure the radiator is full too. If it's not full, there won't be fluid around that. It won't work the way it's supposed to work. So we're still a long way away from getting there. We're only at 131 right now. We'll just keep monitoring this, checking it both here and here. But that's the temperature we want to look at. Now this thing does have a bad exhaust leak. It also has a broken hanger midway back, which is why it's got the exhaust leak, because the exhaust is moving around too much. I don't know if he's going to want to deal with that or not, but that's not for this video anyway. So we'll just keep monitoring this until we get up to full temperature. 164. 161. And one thing I did forget to talk about testing was the horns. They work just fine. I was just about to give up on these things and test them manually, and it came on because it was at 200 degrees. Should go about 195. We got one not working here, so we'll have to check the connections on that one and make sure that it's a dead fan and not just a bad connection. So we know it's coming on, and we'll see the temperature's dropping now. We'll be looking for them to shut off around 180, 185-ish, 190. All right, so they shut off right around 190. And I think I got this one working now. It appeared to be just not a good enough connection here, so we'll see if it comes on this time. And we'll have to monitor that a few times. Make sure we got a good connection and that's working reliably. Oh, I think it's got maybe a bad wire to the motor potentially. All right, so we'll take a better look at the wiring here, see why it works and doesn't work and works and doesn't work. But we also don't have any temperature gauge working right now. And that could just be the sensor itself, could be bad. So I will have to look into that now too. Now, unfortunately, since this still has the air pump on it, this temperature sending unit is down underneath there, which it's really tough to get to on these late cars. But basically, this is what the sending unit looks like. There's two different versions of this. One is for rubber bumper cars, the other is for chrome bumper cars. And this one's black. This is what's supposed to be for the late cars. And the other ones are going to be red. That's supposed to denote the difference between the resistance ratings for the different gauges for the 77 and up and the 76 and earlier, because these were different gauges. So what you can do is just take a multimeter and go across from here to ground. And if you got an open circuit, no resistance whatsoever, it's a bad switch. Now, if it do have resistance between there, it should read something on the gauge whether it's right or not. Now, the other thing is, these switches over the years, the aftermarket has done just an absolutely wonderful job of making these things correct, you know? Sometimes you have to put the black one in the early cars or the red one in the late cars to make everything read correctly. It's just the world we live in these days. Now that everything's been gone through and tested, and not until everything's tested, then we can finally bolt in the dash for good. Now, you always got to make sure that you're not pinching any wires, because you can, when you bolt up the steering column, you can get a wire, one of these wires can get pinched in underneath here and go bare and short out. Same thing with the console when you're putting everything in here, or wires here when you're putting the screws through the side of the console, you can actually get into a wire. So you got to be careful with that stuff. And I think that's actually what happened and why this had the meltdown it had. A wire got pinched somewhere, but it was too melted to tell what wire it was. So always be careful. Don't just stuff wires and jam the radio in, or you could end up with a meltdown just like this thing had.